Hello everybody, my name is Boulevard, and today I'm teaming up with Riot Games and Mastering Runeterra to bring you a meta viewer guide for the World Championship. And I did that. I shot that video. And then they told me that Heisho's getting hotfix nerfs, so now we gotta shoot the video over again. But this is all speculatory anyway. Players still haven't locked in their deck list. But this is going to serve as a baseline, give you an idea of what we should be expecting to see at the World Championship and why. So bear with me on that. And of course, if we're talking about what we expect to see, we have to start with Jaxorn. This has been the dominant mid-range deck for the entire year, and now with the inclusion of Yudalski Snowdog, between Yudalski, Omen Hawk, and Glacial Saurian, the top unit of your deck has never been bigger. And with how much Overwhelm has snuck into this list, including scout weapons that can appear, the stats are really the only thing that matter. You translate them directly into damage no matter how many blockers your opponent has, and ultimately this is just one of the most consistent decks out there. And now with a hotfix getting thrown into the mix, players are really going to be defaulting to comfort picks so that they have one less deck that they need to test to try to figure out the secret sauce. In fact, Yudalski is doing so well that players are even once again looking at Darius Gnar. While this deck doesn't have the resiliency or the results of Jaxorn, it's not too far behind. It's not too far off in terms of playstyle. Obviously, you've got a few more stuns, things like Pirouette, Decisive Maneuver. It's a little more explosive, with things like Darius being a much earlier threat than something like Ornn. Usually you still have to wait for Ornn to level, but Red Barbed Razor Mace adds a lot to this list, and Noxus in general giving another very powerful overwhelm threat and just playing with the new curse mechanic a little bit. So Darius Gnar not going to be anywhere near as popular as Jax Ornn, but still should show a decent presence. Now, previously, I wanted to highlight Karmaset, and I was unsure where this really fell in because of Heisho lists, and it's like, okay, Karmaset's been the predominant control deck for the entire year, the predominant late game deck for the entire year, but with Heisho coming down pre-turn 10, how are players going to deal with this? But Karmaset now doesn't have to worry about Heisho at least as much with the spell shield gone, with the cost increase, so I think a lot of players are going to default back to Karmaset, on top of the fact that because this has been around as long as Jax Ornn, this is a huge comfort pick for a lot of the players, and ultimately it's just kind of stalling until we get to turn 10. Once you get that Karma and Set combo established and start double spell slinging and throwing down showstoppers turn after turn, you really take over the board, slowly grind out your opponent, and again, with Heisho gone, I think that's a more viable strategy that players were already very familiar with, so expecting a decent showing from Karma Set as well. Now, Jinx is the one old deck that we expect to see with absolutely no changes from Fate's Voyage Beyond. You can see the sample list here has no new cards in it, and while you could argue that aggro was doing well because everybody was experimenting with Heisho, this wasn't just playing against Heisho lists, and in fact, this deck has been doing better and better as time has gone on. So while players are looking to play new forms of aggressive lineups, going a lot more combo-oriented with Riven decks recently, you can't beat old classics in Jinx, sometimes containing Kennen as well, but this is just sort of the premier standout aggro/burn deck that we have in LOR right now, and despite the fact that Heisho has taken some hits, you still fully expect to see Jinx represented at the top of the aggro charts. And even though Heisho's gone, you're still going to see Elder Dragon. Volibear is the list that players are going for most often, and this is just another in a long line of ramp into large units that we've had here in Legends of Runeterra. Now, Heisho does open up some speculation as to whether or not we'll come back to War Mother's Call, or what that's going to look like, but for now, players are even still trying to figure out what is the best way to play this list. Is it going to be prominent enough that you need to play cards like Otacon and Cythria, Lady of Clouds, in order to go over the top of the other Elder Dragon lists? Or do you need to play a little bit lower to the ground, using cards like Berserker Ursine and Asalia, Figurehead of the Deep, in order to play more effectively with the Dragon boons? But at the end of the day, it's pretty straightforward. It's ramp into large units, and if things can't kill you fast enough, then you can come down and start to stabilize, and it's really hard for decks like Jaxorn and Darius Gnar to actually punch through once you start throwing down giant unit after giant unit, and of course, everybody's just waiting to see an Elder Dragon level up on stream. Now, when we talk about other known decks, it's kind of weird how many of them Morgana has actually butted her way into. When we talk about Formidable, this was one of the premier mid-range decks in the back half of the year as Freljord started to get a lot better, as Sky Splitter was released, is basically the way to put it. And now this list has moved away from Freljord into Targon, thanks to Morgana, going for a few different new defensive tools like Dark Binding and Guiding Touch, and Mageseeker Inquisitor, which has the Suppression Curse, which will stop your opponent from playing spells. But at the end of the day, this is still just a solid, formidable list. And I think one of the reasons that it's moved away from Freljord into Targon is that Freljord continues to get cool new cards like Yudalski Snowdog, but that one attack is redundant and irrelevant on these formidable units because they don't play with their attack power. Instead, Mageseeker Jr. is coming in to tax your opponent even harder off of the curses that you are throwing onto them, and ultimately it's a pretty cool list. Mountain Drake has even made it into the mix sometimes, but this is just another solid standard mid-range deck, mostly something that we're familiar with, but with a nice new twist. Another area where Morgana has moved in is actually into the combo-y aggressive style decks. Previously, this was Gwen Riven, which was one of the standout decks at the LCQ, but now is moving into Targon and away from Shadow Isle. And what you lose in Opulent Foyer and Hallowed buffs, you are gaining in tempo. The ability to stun up your opponent's units and lock them down, make them pay mana, just to unlock the units they already have on board, stops them from developing on the board further, and ultimately no one really wants to pay 2 or 4 mana to unlock their 1-cost blockers, so you are able to push through with all of your cheap and effective units. So many 1-drops in this list, and then again, we've got Dark Binding, Moonlight Affliction, Shield Vault, stunning out what units your opponent have that are down, that are not locked down by shackles, and ultimately very excited to see if this or Gwen Riven will come out on top as the premier Riven aggro deck, so to speak, but ultimately Morgana, again, just very versatile in the kinds of decks that you can put her into. And while I'm not convinced that Morgana Seraphine is going to be the spell-slinging deck of the event, I do want to highlight Seraphine, and this is the most played Seraphine list so far. We know that Seraphine's going to show up to the World Championship. That's a given. Whether it is Ionia, Bandle City, Targon, Noxus, or some other region remains to be seen, and with Heisho being a predominant meta figurehead, people were leaning very aggressively, which made Cosmic Youngling a more appealing option, so now Seraphine players are going to have to adapt with Heisho gone, and ultimately I'm just kind of excited to see what happens, because everybody loves to see the Singleton archetype with Pursuit of Perfection at the helm, and while, again, not convinced it's going to be Morgana, there will be some Seraphine decks here, because the Spell-Slinging archetype is still a very powerful one, and if people are still going down on Explorers, then Sunken Temple and Back Alley Bar and all the landmarks get to come through at full power, and really show you why those have to be auto-includes in a lot of archetypes. And then finally, I want to talk about the Mordekaiser decks. These are a little bit more fringe, a little bit harder to figure out. They're not performing super well right now, but I'm sure that they will show up at the World Championship. We have Mordekaiser Scion, which is a great explosive combo-y deck. Obviously, Scion and Soul Cleave was a natural pairing when Soul Cleave first came out, but now the Mordekaiser and Deathless archetype add so much more to this list. And again, what we're really getting out of the Scion is the explosive combo potential between Soul Cleave, Legion of the Severed giving Deathless over to other units, and Spectral Ironhound from the Variety patch. There's just so much potential packed into this list. The synergies between Mordekaiser and Scion are absolutely phenomenal. But if this is a little too gimmicky for you, then players are still trying out Mordekaiser Nasus, again, trying to find the right list. They're predominantly Shadow Isle, but Castigate and Vengeance and Rite of Negation come in to help you slow down the game a little bit more and play more of a controlled style. Nasus gets incredibly large, incredibly quickly in a list like this, larger and faster than I've ever seen a Nasus deck previously. And again, not having 2 7-mana champions does help to smooth out the curve a little bit, but Mordekaiser is something that players are still trying out. There's some combo-y builds out there, but I think if we're going to see Mordekaiser, it would be in the form of Scion or Nasus most likely. So I hope that helps a little bit, and don't forget to tune into the World Championship from December 14th to 16th. I will see you there.